The greatest boxer of his era was never allowed to fight for the title he deserved. Not once, not for 15 years. He beat future champions, terrified reigning ones, and fought so often that no one, not even the man himself, could say for certain how many times he had stepped into a ring. Some records say over 300 fights. By the time it was over, he was blind, broke, and living in a single room, forgotten by the sport he had never been allowed to rule. His name was Sam Langford. To understand why he was avoided, you have to understand the world he entered. Boxing in the early 1900s ran on a system called the color line. What was the color line in boxing? It was an unofficial but iron rule that black fighters could challenge for lesser titles, could fight each other, could even beat white contenders in non-title bouts, but could not get a shot at boxing's biggest prize, the heavyweight championship, once a black man held it or looked close to winning it. Jack Johnson broke through that wall in 1908. Sam Langford never did, even though many who watched them both thought Langford was the better fighter. He was born in Nova Scotia, Canada in 1883 and left home as a teenager with almost nothing. He learned to fight in the gyms of Boston, which is where he picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career, the Boston Terrors. He was short for a heavyweight, standing around 5'7", but his arms were unusually long and his hands were fast in a way that fighters twice his size could not match. He rarely weighed more than 185 pounds. Many of the men he fought outweighed him by 20, 30, even 40 pounds. It did not seem to matter. In April of 1906, a 22-year-old Langford stepped into the ring with a rising heavyweight named Jack Johnson. Johnson won the decision over 15 rounds, but something happened in that fight that would shape the next 2 decades of Langford's career. Johnson had felt Langford's power up close, and 2 years later, Johnson became heavyweight champion of the world by beating Tommy Burns in Australia. From that point on, Johnson never gave Langford a rematch. Why wouldn't a champion fight the man he had already beaten? Ask most boxing historians and they will tell you the same thing. Johnson had won a close fight against a smaller, younger, hungrier version of Langford and had no interest in finding out what a fully grown Langford could do with a title on the line. What made a boxer worth avoiding in the first place? It was not just power. It was the combination of power, speed, and a kind of ring intelligence that let a smaller man read a bigger man's habits within a round or two and then punish them for the rest of the fight. Langford could fight going forward or backward, could work the body as easily as the head, and rarely showed the kind of fatigue that usually slows a fighter down after 10 rounds. Opponents who agreed to face him early in his career often did not agree to face him twice. So Langford did what an avoided fighter had to do to survive. He fought everyone else. He fought other black heavyweights of the era considered too dangerous for white champions to touch. Men like Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, and Harry Wills, sometimes a dozen times each, in a grim circuit boxing historians would later call Fistiana's Forgotten Murderers Row. He fought in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Paris, in Melbourne, and Buenos Aires, wherever a promoter could scrape together a purse. Some of those purses were small, a few $100s, barely enough to cover a train ticket and a hotel room, at a time when a ringside ticket to a major fight cost less than $2. He fought bigger men constantly. How did a fighter under 6 feet tall and under 200 pounds compete with heavyweights so much larger? Langford's timing and his left hook did the work his size could not. Fight after fight, he found the same opening and closed it the same way. And observers who watched him for decades said his hook never seemed to lose its power even as the years piled up. The boxing writer and historian Nat Fleischer, who founded the Ring magazine and watched nearly every great fighter of the first half of the 20th century, later ranked Langford among the greatest fighters he had ever seen, regardless of weight class. That kind of praise from Fleischer was rare, and it tells you how respected Langford was inside the sport, even while he was locked out of its biggest stage. Here is the wall Langford ran into over and over for his entire career. He was too good to be worth the risk. champions, and their handlers had learned the lesson of Jack Johnson twice over. First, avoid him before he wins the crown, because losing to him would end your climb. Then, once you have the crown, avoid him even more, because a black challenger who could dethrone you brought a threat no promoter of that era wanted to sell tickets around. Langford was punished for his own greatness. The better he got, the fewer real opportunities he was given, until avoiding Sam Langford became something close to a rule of the sport, spoken about among managers the way you'd talk about a fighter with a communicable disease. What happens to an athlete who is too dangerous for the top of his sport to accept? In Langford's case, the answer was 2 more decades of touring, smaller purses, and no title shot, ever, at any weight, in a career that some estimates put at over 300 professional bouts, a number that still puts him among the most active fighters in boxing history. Consider what that circuit actually meant day to day. A fighter on the murderer's row could be in Boston 1 month, Paris the next, and Buenos Aires after that, crossing an ocean for a single night's purse because no promoter in his own country would build a title picture around him. He fought Sam McVeigh and Joe Jeanette more than a dozen times apiece, brutal, grinding rematches against men who knew his tendencies as well as he knew theirs. Why would a fighter agree to face the same dangerous opponent again and again instead of chasing new names? Because those were often the only fights on offer. The title picture was closed to all of them, so they were left to fight each other over and over for whatever a promoter would pay, while the championship they had all earned the right to challenge for stayed just out of reach. By the mid-1920s, the fights were starting to catch up with him. Boxing in that era offered almost no protection for a fighter's eyes, and the blows Langford had absorbed and thrown for 20 years had begun to cloud his vision with cataracts. He kept fighting anyway, because fighting was the only income he had ever known. In 1926, in his final recorded bout, he was reportedly fighting nearly blind, relying on instinct and memory of where an opponent should be rather than what he could actually see. He retired that year in his early 40s with no pension, no title, and failing sight that would only get worse. Within a few years, he was completely blind. For nearly 2 decades after that, Sam Langford essentially vanished. He lived in poverty in New York City, first in Harlem, later in a nursing home, largely alone, his name unspoken by a sport that had moved on to new champions and new stars who had never heard of him. In 1944, a sportswriter named Al Laney went looking for him on a hunch that the old fighter might still be alive somewhere in the city. He found Langford blind and living in a single small room, remembering fight after fight from memory in astonishing detail, despite never having been able to read a word about his own career in the newspapers that covered it. Laney's article ran in the New York Herald Tribune, and it did what Langford's own fists had never fully managed. It reminded the boxing world he existed. A benefit fund was organized soon after to support him in his final years. Why was a fighter this good forgotten so completely? The mechanism is almost too simple. He was never allowed to hold the title that would have kept his name in the record books that mattered to casual fans. Championship belts are what most people remember, not win totals, and Langford's belt was permanently withheld. Combine that with the fact that he fought in an era before radio broadcasts and television reached most American households, and before more than a handful of his fights were captured on any surviving film, and you get a career that lived almost entirely in the memory of the people who were actually there. Once those witnesses started to die out, so did the common knowledge of just how good Sam Langford had been. Is there a modern equivalent to what happened to Sam Langford? Boxing historians point to it as the clearest case in the sport's history of a fighter's talent working against him, an athlete so feared that avoiding him became the safest career move for an entire generation of champions. Today, Sam Langford's name survives mainly among boxing historians and inside the International Boxing Hall of Fame, where he was inducted in 1990, decades after his death in 1956. His story is cited whenever the sport discusses fighters who were denied title shots for for reasons that had nothing to do with their ability in the rings. It is impossible to say for certain how good Sam Langford truly was, because he was never given the one stage that would have let the whole world find out. What is certain is this: the greatest boxer of his era was never allowed to fight for the title he deserved, and history finally remembered him anyway.